On the morning of June 24, 2016, Britons woke up in a different country. The referendum result, with nearly 52% voting to leave the European Union, sent shockwaves through society. It was immediately clear that this was a turning point that would define the nation's trajectory for decades. For some, Brexit was a historic mistake, heralding political isolation and economic stagnation. For others, it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to cast off the Brussels chains that had bound Britain too long. The promise of taking back control and sovereignty captured the imagination of millions. Out of this political upheaval, the Conservative Party forged the concept of Global Britain. It was a sweeping promise of a reborn, dynamic, forward-looking United Kingdom, ready once again to play a leading role on the world stage. The narrative fused echoes of imperial grandeur with a futuristic vision. The days when London presided over an empire on which the sun never set were long gone, and so too was the nature of global competition. Territorial conquest had given way to battles for economic and technological supremacy. Global Britain was meant to be an empire fit for the 21st century, built not on colonies, but on economic strength, science and innovation. I am profoundly optimistic about the UK's place in the world and our ability to seize the opportunities ahead, Prime Minister Boris Johnson declared in March 2021, unveiling a government strategy paper titled Global Britain in a Competitive Age, a roadmap for a post-Brexit era. The doctrine soon found its physical manifestation. Just 2 months later, in May 2021, HMS Queen Elizabeth, the most powerful warship in Royal Navy's history, sailed from Portsmouth on her maiden global mission. More than a military asset, the carrier was meant to be the visible proof of Britain's revived naval power and its renewed global ambitions. But like every grand vision, Global Britain ultimately has to face reality. Nearly a decade on from the Brexit referendum and 5 years after the UK's formal departure from the EU, a fundamental question lingers. Has Britain found its new place on the world stage? Or is it still adrift, caught between American and European spheres of influence, wistfully gazing at maps of its former empire? Let's find out. Knowing a foreign language is one of the most practical skills you can have today. It makes traveling easier, boosts your career, and helps you understand the world better. The problem? Traditional learning methods are often slow and frustrating. That is where Speakly comes in, an app that helps you start speaking a new language up to several times faster than with standard methods. Instead of memorizing hundreds of useless words, Speakly teaches you only what is truly useful in everyday situations. On top of that, you get access to an intelligent AI trainer, available 24/7 to answer your questions, like having a private tutor in your pocket. The learning experience is engaging. You will find listening and writing exercises, practical tasks, and even music recommendations, so studying doesn't feel like a boring chore, but an enjoyable part of your day. Best of all, you can grab a lifetime plan, one payment for unlimited language learning forever. Click the link in the description to check out the offer. To define the concept of Global Britain, one first has to grasp the scale of its creator's ambitions. The official blueprint for this doctrine was laid out 4 years ago in the already mentioned report Global Britain in a Competitive Age. It was the most comprehensive review of British foreign and defense policy since the Cold War, and its tone was unambiguously optimistic. Brexit was not framed as a problem, but as a quote, unique opportunity. The report envisioned a reborn global power, built on 4 pillars. The first pillar was to turn Britain into a scientific and technological superpower. Technology would serve as the engine of the economy, with a newly created agency modeled on America's DARPA, the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency, ARIA, armed with a budget of £800 million, tasked with securing British leadership in fields that would define the 21st century, such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology. This technological might was meant to be complemented by an ideological mission. Global Britain would be, quote, a force for good, actively shaping an open international order. In this narrative, the United Kingdom, drawing on its historic legacy, would stand as a guardian of democracy and free trade. The third pillar was military. London pledged to allocate an additional £24 billion to defense over 4 years, alongside a decision to expand its nuclear arsenal to 260 warheads. The message was clear. Britain intended to once again speak the language of hard power. But it was the fourth pillar that was the strategic and symbolic heart of the global Britain vision, the so-called Indo-Pacific tilt. It marked a definitive break with the legacy of Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who in the 1960s withdrew Britain's military presence, quote, east of Suez. Now the return to the Pacific would serve not only as a showcase of the Royal Navy's renewed strength, but also as a bold expression of London's revived commercial ambitions. After all, the Indo-Pacific accounts for about 40% of global GDP and is the fastest growing region in the world. On paper, the Global Britain concept looked flawless. It was a coherent and powerful vision of renewed greatness, promising technological supremacy and a symbolic imperial return to the Indo-Pacific, cloaked in the moral justification of being a force for good. Why then this carefully crafted project almost immediately revealed itself to be little more than a facade, behind which lurked the steady erosion of the country's real power? The answer lies not in the details of the Global Britain plan, but in the psychology of Britain's political class. The gulf between London's imperial self-image and the state's actual capabilities is the key to understanding British policy since 1945. Grand projects such as Global Britain serve less as realistic strategies and more as Potemkin villages, designed to soothe national pride and mask a steady decline in relevance. The trajectory of Global Britain was, in fact, the logical outcome of a deeply rooted pathology, a permanent flight from realism. To fully understand this condition, one has to return to its original source, the humiliation of Suez in 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, acting on imperial instincts from a bygone era, decided on military intervention in a secret pact with France and Israel. While the Allies succeeded in seizing the canal, the episode ended in humiliating political defeat. The United States flatly rejected London's imperial maneuver. President Eisenhower threatened to trigger a sterling crisis by dumping British bonds. With no alternative, Britain backed down, withdrawing its troops in humiliation. In an instant, it became clear. Britain was no longer an empire, and America was the new global hegemon. This humiliation, the sudden, painful loss of imperial status, gave rise among Britain's elites to what has since been called the, quote, Suez Syndrome. Its influence on British strategic thinking remains enormous, and it manifests in two ways. First, it installed a deeply rooted conviction that Britain must never act against the will of the United States. Loyalty to Washington, from Iraq to Afghanistan, became a cardinal principle of UK foreign policy, seen as insurance that London would never again be left stranded on the battlefield. Second, and far more corrosively, the Suez Syndrome produced a compulsive need to prove to the world, and above all to itself, that Britain is still a global player. This impulse drives British elites to regularly announce ambitious but hollow great power projects, symbolic attempts to overcome the trauma of the 1956 and to proclaim that Britain is, quote, back in the game. The imprint of the Suez syndrome is evident in the Global Britain project. Take its central pillar, the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. This is not an independent British strategy, but rather an alignment with Washington's top foreign policy priority: strategic rivalry with China. In practice, Global Britain seeks to elevate its own status by making itself useful to America. At the same time, the Indo-Pacific tilt is also a symbolic attempt to erase the memory of Harold Wilson's 1960s decision to withdraw Britain's military presence east of Suez. Another example is AUKUS, the trilateral pact announced in 2021 between the UK, the US and Australia. London presented it as a strategic masterstroke, but in reality it was a pure vassalage, a project fully dominated by Washington's priorities, with Britain playing the role of junior technology partner in building an anti-China alliance in the Pacific. Worse still, AUKUS triggered a rupture with Paris. Australia tore up a $66 billion contract for French submarines, handing the deal to Washington instead, despite deliveries being years away, leaving Canberra with a so-called submarine gap that could last 2 decades. This flight from realism has a name. Every sound state strategy rests on the iron logic of the so-called triad of ends, ways, and means. The principle is simple. Ambitious political goals, ends, must be pursued through carefully chosen methods, ways, and most importantly, supported by adequate resources, means. If any element is mismatched, the entire strategic construct collapses. The Suez syndrome has left this triad chronically broken in British strategic thinking. The goals are invariably imperial, dictated by great power nostalgia. The means, however, have been steadily shrinking for decades. Global Britain is a textbook case of this pathology, proclaiming goals worthy of a global hegemon, while possessing the resources of a regional power. This gap between ambition and reality is most glaring in the foundation of every form of power: its economy. The political fuel behind Brexit and the subsequent vision of Global Britain was the promise of an economic renaissance. Freed from the chains of Brussels, the British economy was supposed to embark on a path of dynamic growth, driven by new, lucrative trade agreements across the globe. The reality proved brutally different. The UK's own Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, the government's fiscal watchdog, projects that in the long term, Brexit will reduce Britain's trade flows, both exports and imports, by 15% and cut GDP by about 4% compared with the scenario of remaining in the EU. In theory, this is still better than the most pessimistic forecasts, but there are no signs of the promised renaissance, no surge of growth unleashed by breaking free of EU shackles. The much-touted trade boom never materialized. The new freight trade agreements meant to offset the losses have turned out to be largely symbolic, with negligible economic impact. A prime example is Britain's accession to the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Bloc. While more than 99% of UK goods exported to its 11 member states will now be tariff-free, the actual boost to British GDP is estimated at just 0.08% and spread over 15 years. The main reason? London already had trade agreements with most CPTPP members. The same holds true for the much publicized FTA with India. Government forecasts suggest it will add just 0.13% to GDP by 2040. Taken together, these figures reveal a sobering truth. The economic foundation for Global Britain has not been strengthened since Brexit. It has been weakened. And that in turn casts doubt on the second essential pillar of great power status: military strength. The armed forces were meant to be the sharpest tool in the global Britain arsenal. Yet behind the imperial facade and the gleam of new aircraft carriers lies what British officers themselves call a hollow force. Weakened by decades of budget cuts and paralyzed by the astronomical costs of maintaining the nuclear deterrent, which cannibalizes the rest of the defense budget. An army tasked with global ends simply does not possess the means to meet even regional challenges. The most glaring symbol of this facade is the Royal Navy. It was supposed to be the spearhead of the Indo-Pacific tilt. Its flagship assets are the two modern Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, which cost more than £6 billion to build. They were meant to serve as tangible proof of Britain's maritime resurgence. Reality turned out to be different. During HMS Queen Elizabeth's maiden deployment to the Indo-Pacific in 2021, the carrier strike group became a symbol not of strength, but of dependency. 10 of the 18 F-35s on board belonged to the United States, and the escort included a US destroyer and a Dutch frigate. It was a Potemkin strike group in its purest form, British hulls filled with Allied firepower. Worse still, the Royal Navy suffers from a chronic shortage of frigates and destroyers, the backbone of any blue water fleet. Delays in the Type 26 and Type 31 programs, combined with the accelerated retirement of aging Type 23s, mean the number of British frigates is set to fall to just 7 by the end of 2025. The 6 advanced Type 45 destroyers have long struggled with propulsion failures, sharply limiting their availability. The credibility of Britain's Indo-Pacific ambitions was further undermined by the case of HMS Lancaster. The frigate is being withdrawn from the Middle East and scrapped, with no replacement. For the first time in 45 years, the Royal Navy will have no major surface combatant deployed in this key region for global trade. The state of the British Army is even more alarming. At the end of the Cold War, it fielded around 156,000 troops. Today that number has fallen to just 73,000, the lowest since the Napoleonic Wars. This is not only the product of successive budget cuts, but also of a deep recruitment and retention crisis. As Parliament's Defence Committee has warned, in a high-intensity war against a peer adversary, the British Army would burn through its combat capability within months, given its shockingly low stocks of ammunition and equipment. A telling example is the Challenger 2 tank modernization program. Only 148 tanks will be upgraded, barely enough to equip 2 armored regiments. The Royal Air Force boasts advanced aircraft, such as the F-35 and the Eurofighter Typhoon. But here too the problem is lack of mass. Fighter squadrons have been reduced to historic lows, while critical support capabilities have been cut. The early retirement of Boeing E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft and the C-130 Hercules transport fleet has left dangerous gaps that must now be filled by allies. Taken together, Britain's military retains high-end capabilities, but is far too small and underfunded to realize the ambitions of global Britain. It is an armed force sized for a mid-tier European state, not for a global power. Allies see this clearly. They worry that Britain's overstretched, under-resourced military risks becoming not an asset, but a liability. This concern was laid bare in summer 2025, when a British delegation presented plans at the Pentagon to send a carrier to the Indo-Pacific. Elbridge Colby, principal architect of America's national defense strategy, reportedly asked whether it was too late to cancel it, since Washington did not want a British carrier in the region at all. At the root of Britain's conventional military decay lies one fundamental choice: an ever-expanding black hole in the defense budget, maintaining a nuclear arsenal. This year, nuclear forces absorbed 18% of spending, and the costs are rising with programs like the 4 new Dreadnought-class submarines, projected at over £31 billion. In an era of tight budgets, every pound spent on dreadnought is not a pound spent on frigates, tanks, or aircraft. Yet even this supposedly sovereign capability is an illusion. The Prime Minister can authorize a launch, but the Trident system is heavily dependent on the United States. Warheads are built in Britain, but the Trident II D5 missiles are American-made and serviced in the US. The last two Royal Navy test launches, in 2016 and 2024, both failed spectacularly, casting doubt on credibility. This leaves a stark paradox. The UK pours hundreds of billions into a system of doubtful reliability, reliant on an ally, while hollowing out the conventional forces it actually needs. It is the Suez syndrome in practice, clinging to the appearance of global power instead of a pragmatic model. Former Defense Chief David Richards captured it most bluntly, warning that this cannibalization of forces risks turning Britain into, quote, Belgium with nukes. Yet perhaps the clearest proof of global Britain's failure is that a project meant to elevate the UK has instead sped up its internal unraveling. While Westminster elites fixated on the Indo-Pacific ambitions, the foundation of the state, the Union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, began to crack. Brexit was a political gift to Scottish nationalists. In 2016, 62% of Scots voted to remain in the EU. Its forced imposition became their most powerful argument for independence. Today, Scotland is split, with support for secession hovering around 45 to 55%. Time favors separatists, as younger generations overwhelmingly back independence. Brexit has thus turned Scottish independence into a ticking time bomb, with nationalists insisting that 2014 referendum must be repeated. This creates a strategic absurdity. London projects power in the Indo-Pacific while unsure of its own territorial integrity. The irony is still sharper. Britain's entire nuclear arsenal is based at Faslane in Scotland. An independent Scotland would almost certainly demand its removal, stripping the UK of nuclear status and possibly its UN Security Council seat. Global ambitions are, quite literally, hostage to domestic conflict. In Northern Ireland, the consequences are equally stark. In 2022, Sinn Féin, committed to Irish unification, won elections for the first time in the province's history. The party seeks a referendum on reunification by 2030. Polls show support fluctuating between 35 to 45%, not yet a majority, but for the first time a plausible horizon. As in Scotland, demographics steadily favor nationalists. And so the Conservative Party, historically the guardian of unionism, inflicted on the Union a wound deeper than any nationalist rival, sacrificing it on the altar of Brexit ideology. In 1962, former US Secretary of State Dean Acheson famously declared, "Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role." Brexit, with all its promises of a radical break from the past, offered a historic opportunity to finally answer that diagnosis, to abandon post-imperial fantasies and define a new, realistic role for Britain in the 21st century. Instead, the opposite happened. Rather than realism, Brexit triggered the greatest flight from it in decades. The idea of global Britain was never about finding a new role, but about desperately trying to resurrect the old imperial one. It was the same old Suez syndrome and the same Potiemkin power, merely dressed in the shiny garments of globalization and technology. Once again, the gap between imperial ambitions and real capabilities proved too wide to bridge. There is, however, one fundamental difference. This time, in pursuit of national therapy and post-imperial reassurance, Westminster's elites gambled not only with international prestige or a handful of frigates, they put at stake the very future of the state itself, the unity of the United Kingdom, now threatened both by Scottish independence and Irish unification. And that is the ultimate irony of this story, and of London's decades-long flight from reality. A project designed to restore global Britain may, in the end, deliver nothing more than Little England.